Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report here on the Coalition Radio. With you today, as always, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, Irina Tsukerman, that's me, and with us our special guest today, Dr. Aykan Erdemir. He is the senior director of the Turkey program at the FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and a former parliamentarian in Turkey. We will discuss the issue of the future of religious minorities in Turkey in the context of the ongoing economic crisis. What's going to happen with that? Who is actually helping them at the time? The discussion will focus on Dr. Damir's recent article tackling the subject. But before we get into the meat of this discussion, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, your professional experience in this area, just as by way of introducing yourself to our audience.
Sure. Thank you, Irina, for hosting me on your show. I'm a former academic. For long years, I've worked on Turkey's religious minorities, and then I ran for office, got elected from Turkey's pro-secular main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, in 2011, served for 4 years in the Turkish Parliament, and I have done a lot of work when it comes to defending rights and freedoms of all citizens, including Turkey's ethnic and religious minorities. And all along, I have seen Turkey's current government, Islamist-rooted Justice and Development Party government, as being really bad news, not only for Turkey, but for the greater Middle East. And those of us who are watching Turkey this year, I think, have seen firsthand the destruction in institutions, in the social fabric, in Turkey's economy, this Islamist government has caused. And since 2016, I have been here in Washington with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and I'm now the senior director of the Turkey program. And we try to raise awareness about Turkey's descent into authoritarianism, pivot from NATO and its transatlantic values toward the authoritarian bloc of countries such as Russia, Iran, and China, and also the persecution of Turkey's ethnic and religious minorities.
One thing I'd like to note is that many people believe that when AKP came to power, it came appealing to a broad swath of the population, claiming that they would do away with ultra-nationalist, ethnocentric sentiments that was somewhat prevalent under the Kemalist parties in the past, and it would focus on religious tolerance and so forth. Over time, however, we saw not only the religious freedoms being curtailed, but also an appeal to this ethnocentric, ultra-nationalist sentiment that affected the Kurds, for instance, even outside political party circuits, civilians not involved in politics or activism. So, what AKP is an Islamist party, but it somehow also plays to kind of this ethnocentric sentiment and tries to use two levers of power instead of just one, similar to what Iran is actually doing. How is that working out? Are they able to keep this balance of these two bases?
Now, to give a very brief overview of the last 2 decades, right from the very start, both Erdogan, Turkish, leader Erdogan, and his Islamist-rooted AKP's chief goal was to consolidate power. So as they tried to consolidate power, they cut deals with various other factions and built coalitions, temporary tactical coalitions. And early on, yes, the AKP's approach was less ethnicity-based or nation-based and more the Islamic Ummah, Islamic community-based. So they offered a religion-based approach as an alternative to what Turkey had before then. Now, Turkey's secularism was never perfect. It was strong on freedom from religion, but it wasn't strong on freedom for religion. And AKP exploited this, promising to strengthen Turkey's religious freedoms, and did make inroads into some of Turkey's both ethnic and religious minority communities, as well as among Turkey's liberal voters. But skeptics like me, right from the very start, warned the Turkish public that this was just a ruse. This was just an Islamist trick, just like in Iran, to consolidate power. And now, when we take a look at where Turkey is, Erdogan has completely given up his earlier, rights and freedoms agenda, which was basically a lip service, but he no longer pays a lip service to that. And he has cut a new deal with Turkey's ultra-nationalists. So now Turkey is ruled by a toxic coalition of Islamists and ultra-nationalists. And what makes this even worse is that this is also compounded by hyper-centralization that Erdogan brought about. Because now Turkey is ruled by an executive presidential system. Erdogan has amassed executive, legislative, and judicial powers as president. And it's basically one-man rule, which has undermined Turkey's institutions, Turkey's rules-based market economy, as well as Turkey's foreign and security relations with its traditional allies in the West. So I think this year, Turkey's voters have witnessed firsthand the destruction, the fallout from Erdogan's misguided policies, not only through devaluation of the Turkish lira, through hyperinflation, but also Turkey's increasing isolation in the region, and the growing tension between Turkey and a large number of regional powers, which then also has its impact on Turkey's international trade as well as its relations.
Now, for the first 10 years of its governance, AKP was doing quite well economically. What went wrong and why?
Now, the key to Turkey's rise in the early 2000s was twofold. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, before Erdogan's rise to power, Turkey already had a program in place through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And this was a program implemented by a secular politician, Kemal Dervish, who basically built Turkey's legal and institutional infrastructure for a rules-based economy and for a sound banking system. At the same time, Turkey's ongoing European Union accession process, which also Erdogan contributed to early on, attracted Western capital inflows to Turkey. So when you had an already sound economic policy in place, which Erdogan adhered to during his early years in politics, and the European Union accession process, the result was a boom in the Turkish economy, capital inflows, numerous Turkish-Western partnerships, and this also reflected it in the increasing per capita income. So one could argue that during the first decade, the Turkish electorate, except for rights and freedoms issues, did not have much to complain when it comes to their rising living standards. So Turkey's middle class was expanding. And the key debate in Turkey back then was how Turkey could overcome the middle income trap, meaning Turkey reached the $10,000 per capita income level, but people couldn't see moving forward, couldn't see a strategy for moving forward. But the last decade, meaning the second decade of Erdogan in power, we have seen a reversal of fortunes for Turkey and its economy. The more he consolidated power, the more he undermined Turkey's institutions and the rule of law and private property rights, the more he cracked down on dissent and the opposition. And this led to, as of 2019, for example, and 2020, one of the biggest outflows from Turkish equities and bonds in the history of Turkey. And at the same time, we have seen a domestic capital flight as well, meaning not only Western investors, but also Turkish business people also chose to take their assets out of Turkey, given the erosion of the rule of law and private property rights. So, lesson is, if you undermine institutions, for example, the autonomy of the regulatory institutions and the central bank, if you institutionalize arbitrary rule instead of a rules-based market economy, then your economy will take a turn for the worse. And we have seen almost 60% devaluation of the Turkish lira this year, which made it the worst performing emerging market currency. And now, as we speak, Turkey's per capita income is, possibly down to $7,000 range. And Turkey is now being discussed as, is it really an emerging market, or is it now being relegated to a frontier market?
What caused why, in response to these measures, hasn't there been a resurgence of pro-capitalist, pro-market parties and efforts? How did Erdogan manage to prevent that from happening, given that it seems to be a central issue that would unite most of the country?
Now, when we take a look at Erdogan's approval ratings as of this month, in the middle of Turkey's economic turmoil, devaluation, hyperinflation, mass poverty, it is still 38%. So it comes close to President Biden's approval ratings in the United States. And one could argue that this is quite an outlier case, meaning rarely does one see such economic mismanagement, corruption, coupled with quite a solid approval rating. Now, this shows us the importance of ideology. That is, how Erdogan uses political Islam as well as ultranationalism to rally his followers, his loyal followers, around the flag. So this is one disconnect Turkey's politics and economy continue to have. Because elsewhere, where we have seen similar economic crises, such as in Greece, in Cyprus, in Argentina, we have seen mass unrest. We have seen governments change. We have seen people taking to streets in protest. We have a very oppressive regime in Turkey that does not allow much dissent. But at the same time, ideologically, the regime succeeds in keeping a core group of supporters behind its policies through misinformation and disinformation campaigns, through its control over the media and social media. And this basically leads to an overwhelming polarization. So one could argue that Turkey is today divided among two factions. One, loyal followers of Erdogan, who appear to be sticking with him until the very bitter end, even if it means bankruptcy and poverty, similar to what Maduro's supporters did in Venezuela. And on the other hand, there is the other half of Turkey, pro-secular, pro-Western, kind of pro-market economy, who are extremely critical of Erdogan's policies and where Turkey is headed, but they don't necessarily have the power to change Turkey's trajectory or force Erdogan back to orthodox economic policy.
Is it because they don't control any soft power institutions?
Now, Turkey's pro-Western, pro-secular segments used to be quite influential, in academia, in the media, in Turkey's bureaucracy, among the intelligentsia. But over the last 2 decades, Erdogan has systematically purged, all non-Islamists and non-ultranationalists from all these sectors. He now controls the universities. His cronies have taken over the media. He has purged all dissidents from Turkey's civil service. So basically, he runs a one-man show to such an extent that even at the central bank, which should be technically, legally, an independent institution in charge of Turkey's monetary policy, we have seen Erdogan dictate interest rates. And here comes the bizarre part of his approach to monetary policy. The orthodox economic view around the world is that to fight inflation, you have to raise interest rates. Now, Erdogan argues that he can lower inflation by lowering interest rates. So this is the exact opposite of what economists would advise him to do so. So against all the advice from the central bank and its monetary policy council, Erdogan basically imposed his unorthodox policies on the central bank. And this has led to the 60% devaluation that we have seen this year. This has led to the exodus from the Turkish lira, and with it, of course, hyperinflation, and the decline in Turkey's minimum wage to almost $200. Now, one could argue that how could Erdogan get away with it? How does he legitimize this irrational, misguided policy in the eyes of his followers? And we have seen Erdogan repeatedly make reference to the Islamic law. He argues, according to Islam, he says, interest rates are forbidden. So he claims he has a crusade to get rid of interest rates in Turkey. Now, whether he believes in what he preaches or not, this definitely does have a legitimizing effect on his loyal followers who see what Erdogan has been doing as part and parcel of his overall Islamist policy in Turkey.
Now, we are seeing other Muslim majority countries around the world that have I would say people who are believers in power, in charge in the government institutions, and yet do not suffer from the same economic malaise as the Turkish economy. How does he explain the fact that all these other countries which are Muslim majority and which follow Muslim traditions do not have the same issues?
Now, of course, that's really the million-dollar question, meaning Turkey. There are numerous Muslim majority countries around the world. And in fact, Turkey has been an outlier in the sense that it was one of the few that institutionalized secularism in its constitution, and that systematically separated mosque and state until Erdogan reversed all that. And we see all these other Muslim majority countries managing quite well, an international, finance system, a solid banking system, and a relatively sound monetary policy with policy rates set by the central bank. Now, when we take a look at Erdogan's first decade in power, we have seen the central bank to be relatively independent. and the interest rates were set in accordance with basically orthodox economic views. So even Erdogan now is in contradiction with his earlier periods in power. So one could argue that, I would argue that today what he's offering as an explanation that this is what the Islamic law dictates is, I think, just a pretext to cover up his mismanagement and corruption. Because just to give you a quick snapshot, what happened was in 2018, Erdogan appointed his son-in-law, Berat Albayrak, as Turkey's Minister of Finance and Treasury. Now, under his son-in-law's rule, by the way, he was not fit for this job. He did not have either the proper training nor the experience to be, Turkey's economy czar, basically. And under his management, up until today, he did resign last year, but up until today, Turkey sold over $140 billion worth of foreign currency through back-channel deals from the central bank. Now, this depleted Turkey's net international reserves, excluding swap deals, and put the Turkish government under, and also the Turkish currency, the lira, under enormous pressure. Because at this point, now that the central bank has depleted its reserves, it is no longer able to basically defend the lira against the US dollar. And Erdogan's lowering of the policy rate through the central bank is putting additional pressure on the Turkish lira. So from an economics perspective, there are very clear-cut ways to explain why Turkey is in this mess. And it has nothing to do with Islamic law. And again, I would argue that this is just a pretext that Erdogan is using to cover up all the mismanagement by himself and his son-in-law, Berat Albayrak.
So while embarking on this corrupt and self-serving, arguably, course of action, he also started cracking down on minorities and basically scapegoating them and blaming internal divisions alleged that he himself contributed to instigating for to basically redirect popular attention to these issues and claiming national security, and while at the same time bringing in terrorist factions, or at the very least turning a blind eye to jihadist groups. How did this not raise any questions that people who were a relatively well integrated portion of the population suddenly became a problem, whereas factions with extreme ideologies were not?
Now, the Erdogan's targeting of and scapegoating of Turkey's religious minorities came in two different phases. On the one hand, since 2013, mass protests, namely the Gezi Park protests, which started in Istanbul and extended to the entire country, Erdogan began to employ conspiracy theories to undermine the opposition. So around that time, he introduced a new concept, namely the interest rate lobby. Now, this was a euphemism for Jews. So this was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory through which Erdogan argued that a global Jewish conspiracy, which he called the interest rate lobby, was trying to take control of Turkey through financial manipulation. And he claimed that the protesters all around Turkey were basically, puppets of this interest rate lobby. So this was the beginning of the scapegoating and the conspiracy theories. Beginning with Turkey's failed coup attempt in 2016, we have seen a second phase of scapegoating and also targeting of minorities. Now, in Turkey's pro-government media, Turkey's Christians and Jews were repeatedly presented as fifth columns serving foreign powers, cooperating with coup plotters, and all sorts of conspiracies were circulated. And we have also seen a systematic targeting, for example, of Christian faith leaders in Turkey and deportations from Turkey. So there were a lot of, for example, Western Christian faith leaders serving in Turkey. And since 2016, we have witnessed them being either deported or denied entry one by one. And one high-profile case, I'm sure you remember, was Pastor Andrew Brunson, who served in Turkey for over 2 decades and then was arrested by the Erdogan regime and spent 2 years in prison on terrorism, coup plotting, and espionage charges. You know, these are, of course, ludicrous charges. But basically, he spent 2 years in prison just as an excuse so that Erdogan can divert the electorate's attention from his own mismanagement and corruption. So today, Turkey's religious minorities have a very precarious existence, meaning they know in the midst of this economic crisis that they will again be targeted and made scapegoats as Erdogan needs a distraction. And furthermore, I argue that now there is a new stage of discrimination in Turkey, which is the stage of being captive communities. So before, religious minorities were just discriminated against. But now, as captive communities, the Erdogan government expects them to be props in spectacles of tolerance that the government orchestrates to whitewash its crimes against minorities, to show to the Western world that religious minorities have nothing to complain. So over the years, we have seen, just like in Iran, these farcical attempts to whitewash the Erdogan regime. Turkey's religious minority communities were forced to sign a letter saying that they have no problems in Turkey and that they enjoy religious freedom. They were forced to sign a letter supporting Turkey's cross-border operations into Syria, targeting ethnic and religious minorities in the region. We have seen them being forced into attending these spectacles of liturgies orchestrated by the government to show that things are okay in Turkey. And of course, Turkey's religious minorities, meanwhile, are voting with their feet, which means they're leaving the country. Turkey's Jewish community is now under 17,000. Turkey's Greek Orthodox community is under 2,000. And many of these communities are now aging communities. All the youngsters are looking for better opportunities abroad, especially in the West. And this now risks bringing Turkey's millennia-long history, Jewish history and Christian history, to an end. So I think that is really the one big risk that awaits Turkey in this century, that the last remains of Turkey's Christian and Jewish heritage could be wiped out owing to Erdogan's policies.
My understanding, particularly with the Jewish community, but it may also be true of the Christian community, is that if the number of community members falls under a certain arbitrary number, their communal property may be confiscated by the state. Is that accurate?
Now, what happens is property rights of Turkey's religious minority communities have always been precarious. So this preceded Erdogan. So it's not all Erdogan's doing. We have seen, for example, throughout the Republican period, a failure of the secular promises, of the secular Republican promises, whereby, first of all, Turkey's religious minority communities failed to attain legal status, a legal persona. So this prevented them from owning property, acquiring property, utilizing property, entering into legal transactions. Second, we have seen through different episodes either unfair taxation policies, especially during the Second World War, that targeted Christians and Jews disproportionately, or later various legal pretexts to take over properties owned by religious minority foundations. Now, today, what compounds this problem is that Turkey's religious minority foundations, which are basically the key institutions for the survival of Turkey's religious minority communities, are blocked since 2013 from electing their board members. So you can imagine what happens in an aging community when you no longer have the ability to elect new board members for vacancies, is that you have a severe institutional crisis. And these minority foundations are the only mechanism through which faith services can be provided, charitable works can be provided, properties could be acquired or held or utilized. So overall, Turkey basically, as Turkey approaches its 100th anniversary of the Republic, the secular republic, which is what the Turkish constitution has promised, has failed to deliver on its promises. And of course, the road forward is actually very clear. Turkey is not only a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also to the European Convention on Human Rights. So, which brings even a higher standard of rights and freedoms for minorities and for religious freedoms. And I would say that the immediate steps need to be, first of all, the recognition of the legal status of religious minorities, allowing them to elect and govern their foundations as they wish, allow them to run their religious schools and train clergy as they wish, and moreover, restitute property confiscated from religious minority communities and compensate them for their losses over the last century. And I think this would once again not only encourage religious minorities to remain in Turkey, but for these communities to flourish as equal citizens of the Turkish Republic.
My understanding is in the past, Kurdish villages had sued for restitution based on property losses in the European courts and won in some cases. Is there any opportunity for the religious minorities to do the same? Is that happening? Because there's literally no reporting on that issue at all. That's available in English.
Now, that's a very important question. And for our audience members, just a quick reminder, Turkey has been a member of the Council of Europe since 1950. And Council of Europe is one of the most important human rights organizations in the world. And its court, which is based in Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights, can have binding rulings on the member states. And these rulings override the rulings of Turkish courts. And as Irina, you said rightly, that Turkey's Kurdish citizens have taken Ankara to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights, in hundreds of thousands or thousands of cases where their property rights, where their political freedoms were basically transgressed by the Turkish government. And they have won significant judgments, often, tens of thousands of euros of compensation from the court. And when we take a look at statistics, Turkey, among all of the Council of Europe members, is the top country for convictions at the European Court of Human Rights. So it is the worst violator of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's followed shortly after by Russia, which is, again, no surprise there. Now, Turkey's religious minorities have also begun to take Ankara to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights, especially Turkey's largest religious minority called the Alevi. This is a Muslim minority, which is pro-secular and very liberal-leaning minority, persecuted by Turkey's Sunni majority. And they have won a number of judgments concerning compulsory religious education, concerning not receiving any services, although from the government, although they pay taxes, and so on and so forth. Now, what we are seeing is the Erdogan government is quite reluctant to abide by the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights. And this, of course, raises the question, what mechanisms does the court and the Council of Europe have to force Erdogan into compliance? Now, throughout the court's history and the Council of Europe's history, there have only been 2 cases whereby the Council of Europe threatened what is called infringement procedures against a member state. The first one was against Azerbaijan for the detention of a dissident. And when the Council of Europe threatened infringement procedures, Baku released that dissident and presented compensation. Now, just earlier this month, the Council of Europe threatened infringement procedures against Turkey for the ongoing detention of Osman Kavala, Turkey's leading philanthropist and minority rights activist, who has been jailed for over 4 years on, again, spurious charges. Now, if Erdogan, again, doubles down on his persecution of minorities and dissidents and refuses to take the European Court of Human Rights' ruling into account, Turkey could either lose its voting privileges at the Council of Europe, or even its membership could be suspended. Now, this, of course, would be quite disastrous, because after almost 70 years as a member of the Council of Europe, if Turkey is removed from the Council, this would signal really the collapse of Turkey's rule of law and democracy, as well as its Western orientation.
And if that happens, though, the Council of Europe at the same time loses any leverage in forcing Turkey into compliance on any issue, though, there will be literally no recourse for the citizens or to sue the government outside the country's jurisdiction, if I'm getting it right. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. As long as they can use this threat of the loss of prestige without actually doing that, but at some point that kind of loses its effectiveness as well. So this membership only goes as far as the government's willingness, interest in maintaining it. If the government decides that they're better off outside its jurisdiction, they're not going to take it very seriously.
Definitely, you're really right, because ultimately, if this issue is about leverage, then if you push Turkey completely out of the Council of Europe, then you lose that leverage. Plus, the Turkish citizens lose the ability to take Ankara to Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights. So over the years, what we have seen is the Council of Europe actually has been moving very slowly, meaning building pressure only step by step on Ankara, hoping to shame Erdogan into compliance. And even with the Osman Kavala case, as I have mentioned, it has been 4 years of pre-trial detention without a conviction, with multiple acquittals to his favor, and still Kavala is in jail. So human rights defenders are arguing that the Council of Europe is really slow. They're arguing that the European Court of Human Rights is really slow, and this is really victimizing dissidents such as Kavala. But at the same time, I think Strasbourg is trying to build pressure slowly and hope that Erdogan would be shamed into compliance. And this actually is a similar to what the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has been trying to do over the years. Because among Turkey's 30 member states, Turkey is the only country, only NATO member state that has been singled out year after year by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, namely USCIRF. Now, this year again, USCIRF recommended the U.S. State Department to put Turkey on its special watch list for, egregious violations of religious freedoms. And the State Department so far has not followed USCIRF's advice. So each year, the State Department shields Turkey and refuses to place it on the list. I guess this results from Turkey's NATO membership, and the U.S. State Department would like to maintain cordial relations. But again, many of the rights defenders and religious freedom advocates would argue that shaming Erdogan could be a more effective way to get him to act when it comes to minority rights, when it comes to religious freedoms, or when it comes to the rule of law issues.
Well, on the one hand, clearly Turkey has not really suffered any serious political or legal consequences as a result of these mass campaigns and the attacks on religious freedoms and this push for extreme policies and complete lack of respect for minority religions and so forth. On the other hand, some would argue that none of these methods really work with authoritarian governments to begin with, and what happens is the population only rallies around the base only rallies around the leader, and in fact we have seen Erdogan use exactly that type of rhetoric of victimhood, of claiming victimhood. And one thing that I've noticed he has managed to employ very successfully is claiming that Turkey, rather than he personally, is being isolated. That Turkey as a state is being suffering from anti-Turkish biased campaigns, rather than he managed to convince the public to follow this idea and create this pushback that these human rights campaigns or criticisms or decisions are anti-Turkish rather than anti-human rights abuse by specific government bodies. So I'm wondering whether you've noticed this and whether you have thought of any way to get around his ability to use this propaganda to continue with this policy, because shaming can have an effect, but it depends on how cohesive those campaigns are, and if they're only partial, then they're not going to be really all that effective. And also, again, authoritarian governments manage to convince their populations that external forces are scapegoating them rather than, and they're being unfairly singled out. So how do you respond to something like that?
Now, human rights pressure has very different effect depending on the nature of the polity and the society. Now, Turkey has had multi-party elections and free and fair elections since 1950. Turkey has a robust civil society, and Turkey has strong opposition parties that managed to join forces and defeat Erdogan in the 2019 municipal elections. Which means when there is Western pressure on Turkey on the human rights front, and when there is an outreach of solidarity, there is a significant constituency in Turkey that appreciates this solidarity, that welcomes the shaming of the Erdogan government, and that has a strong and an indigenous voice for human rights. So in the Turkish case, with that half of the society, I think this message is well received. Now, of course, among Erdogan's Islamist and ultra-nationalist loyal followership, this simply feeds into the conspiracy theories that Turkey has been targeted unfairly, that this is a global conspiracy against Turkey. But ultimately, I think just like with the fall of the Soviet Empire and other similar authoritarian regimes, we need both constant pressure and shaming, but at the same time, also a positive agenda of solidaristic reach out to Turkey's pro-democracy, pro-human rights constituents. And this could be in multiple ways. It could be people-to-people solidarity, civil society solidarity, and it could also be, just to give you an example, Erdogan controls 95% of Turkey's media, but just like Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, played an important role in bringing news, accurate news, bringing messages of freedom and rights and democracy to basically authoritarian countries. I think today there could also be a concerted effort on the part of European and American alliance to help carry a message of hope, democracy, human rights, and pluralism to Turkey. And we have already seen some efforts, like with Voice of America Turkish service, with Deutsche Welle Turkish service, with BBC Turkish service, and also Euronews Turkish. So I think that's a good start, but there could also be greater efforts to reach the Turkish people, expose Erdogan's corruption and oppression, and also push back against disinformation campaigns by Russia and China. Because we have to keep in mind, Turkey is a major battlefield. For Russia, Iran, and China, Turkey and Erdogan could be an important ally. And Erdogan could, in fact, act as a Trojan horse within the transatlantic alliance, within NATO. So you can be sure that Erdogan, until his last day in office, will receive Russian, Chinese, and Iranian support because Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing, the last thing they would want is for Turkey to pivot back to NATO and back to transatlantic values.
Now, you made some really excellent points that I myself share, and I'll get to that, back to that actually momentarily, but I wanted to kind of segue to your article and to the efforts that you're seeing on some local government levels to lend support to the religious minorities. And, then after you explain a little bit more for the audience, then I kind of will tie that back to what you were saying right now and some other things in that category. If you could just tell us what is going on with those people, where are they finding the courage to do that, and what do you think that means for the future?
Now, I mentioned that Turkey now has a hyper-centralized system. Erdogan basically pulls all strings. And, since he has decided to scapegoat Turkey's religious minorities, this really puts them at a very difficult position. And the economic crisis has only compounded these troubles. But at the same time, we have been witnessing really the moral courage and integrity of opposition mayors who were elected to office in 2019 in institutionalizing pluralist and inclusive policies, in reaching out to their Christian and Jewish constituencies, making them feel that they're equal citizens as residents of these, cities such as Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, Antalya, Mersin. Just to give you an idea, today, half of Turkey's population, Turkey has 85 million citizens, half of that population is governed by opposition mayors. And since these are Turkey's major metropolitan centers, the opposition mayors now control 2/3 of Turkey's GDP. And we have also seen not only Turkey's pro-secular main opposition party, Republican People's Party mayors, but also the pro-Kurdish People's Democracy Party, HDP mayors, being very proactive in reaching out to minority communities, especially religious minority communities. I witnessed firsthand, for example, in Diyarbakir, which is Turkey's largest Kurdish city, how the local pro-Kurdish mayors helped the Armenian community rebuild what then became restore the largest Armenian Apostolic Church in the Middle East. Now, this year we have seen efforts by the Istanbul mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, reaching out to the Greek Orthodox community, for example, and trying to help them restore some of the properties which were confiscated from them, and then which basically fell into disrepair. So I think that these symbolic steps are extremely important, not only because they will help sustain these communities, but more importantly, they will provide the much needed hope these communities, and especially their youth, need to continue to stay in Turkey and struggle for their communities.
Now, what you said is very, very important, because just as it's vital to denounce crimes and oppression of dissidents and critics and so forth, it's equally important to raise the profiles of people doing something constructive, and not to create a picture of complete despair and hopelessness, which creates apathy and makes people less helpful and solutions less possible. So I'm wondering what can be done to get more stories of these mayors out, and to create an understanding of the fact that the reality is a little bit more complicated. Yes, Erdogan is doing a one-man show at the top, but at the same time, we can't forget about the fact that people are still capable of doing grassroots initiatives and local initiatives, and use their power, whatever power they have, effectively. How can this be brought to light, and by whom? Because I don't really see a lot of media focus in that, and definitely not national media outlets in the US and so forth.
Now, so far, there are two steps that I would like to commend. One is we have seen, especially Western ambassadors serving in Turkey, paying a visit to these opposition mayors in office. So this is not only a symbol of Western support for the great work they do, but also this is a great way to build people-to-people ties. Meaning, at a time when Erdogan pivots Turkey away from Europe, away from the United States, away from NATO, the fact that opposition mayors have these very warm, cordial relations with Western ambassadors in Turkey, I think sends an important message, both to Turkish people and also to the West, that Turkey is still part and parcel of the West, and there are still significant constituents committed to Turkey's Western orientation. Second, we have seen lately a lot of efforts by especially European mayors, European Union mayors, to come together and meet with their Turkish counterparts. So this is, again, solidarity with Turkey's opposition mayors coming from other mayors serving in the European Union. So I think that's also commendable. But of course, this is not enough. I would recommend more interaction between Western civil society organizations, especially foundations which have the economic means to contribute to inclusive and pluralist projects in Turkey, to join forces with these opposition mayors to promote pluralism. And at the same time, I think we should have various journalism fellowships and journalism support for Western journalists to cover local government news. Because when you think about it, international correspondents in Turkey who work under very difficult conditions, under a lot of pressure from the Erdogan government, only have the bandwidth to follow Turkey's ups and downs in foreign policy, security policy, economic policy. But if we have support for especially up-and-coming journalists who are interested in covering, for example, minority communities, local governments, opposition mayors, then we will begin to see, as you just said, more news about these hopeful developments, this bottom-up promotion of pluralism and inclusivity, also in the Western press, and I think that also can play a positive role.
Well, for my own part, having an outlet that's literally focused on trying to give more light to niche issues or to issues that are not well covered by the mainstream media, I'm more than happy to lend a platform to whoever wishes to contribute in any of those issues. And of course, I'm happy to engage in conversation and publicize the interviews here as well. I also have other podcasts that I do at different times. So the time difference.
And thank you, Irina, for that.
Not an obstacle. So yeah, personally, I'm actually a human rights lawyer myself, and I've engaged in minority issues in Turkey specifically as part of my professional experience, including in Diyarbakir, including with some former mayors. So I have a fairly good idea of how that actually works in practice. But what I'm seeing right now, unfortunately, is that the people who are people in Western countries, in the Arab world, elsewhere, who are critical of Erdogan's policies, they so single-mindedly focus on Erdogan and his party that the actual population ends up being not being addressed, and as a result there is an impression for some Turkish citizens who I've heard from that there is basically this anti-Turkish sentiment, and it's they didn't really get that there's also a sympathy with the population. It becomes more so focused on Erdogan and opposing Erdogan that the positive messaging of supporting better people is not coming across, especially on social media, where it all becomes a battle of talking points and people start bashing each other. So I'm wondering how to kind of engage more of the human voices in discussions, and I don't mean just people in power, but just regular citizens who want to engage with people without everything turning into this kind of polarized sphere of talking about Erdogan himself and making it all about him, and just letting his bots or whatever control the sphere of discussion on social media. How to attract those kind of people more into a sphere of discussion?
Now, I think one great place to start, as I've said earlier, is through these outreaches of solidarity. You just mentioned yourself some of the Kurdish mayors and councillors who worked at the local level, but then who were prosecuted, who were removed from office. Some of them ended up in jail. Some of them ended up in exile. For example, the two mayors in Diyarbakir, the Diyarbakir Metropolitan Mayor, Osman Baydemir, and the sub-provincial mayor of the Sur district, Abdullah Demirbaş, who played a significant role
in his case.
Yeah, so these are two visionary Kurdish mayors who served Diyarbakir in amazing ways, who helped restore the local churches and helped the local minority communities re-flourish, paid dearly. So they're now both in exile after years of legal harassment in Turkey. And for example, I think they need to hear that their work is appreciated. They need people to reach out to them, and not only to them. For example, we need an outreach to Selahattin Demirtas, the former co-leader of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, namely the HDP, who has been in jail on pre-trial detention for 5 years, simply for having the courage to oppose Erdogan in the presidential race. And of course, Erdogan claims he's a terrorist and he's in jail on terrorism charges. But everyone knows this is just a pretext. In Turkey, over 1 million people have been investigated on terrorism charges. If these statistics are correct, then Turkey is, the world's heaviest concentration of terrorists. Basically, anyone the government, doesn't appreciate is framed as a terrorist. So, what better way to help with the positive messaging than to reach out to all these individuals at the local level, at the national level, who have stood up for rights and freedoms, who have stood up for minorities, for religious freedoms, for the rule of law and due process. Pay them a visit in prisons, pay them a visit in exile, and also raise the cases of all those elected mayors, Kurdish mayors, pro-Kurdish mayors, who were removed from office since the municipal elections and replaced by Erdogan's hand-picked quote-unquote trustees. Erdogan called them trustees, but these are people who now serve as acting mayors instead of the local elected mayors, and who have no connection to these communities, who don't speak their languages, who don't know their customs and traditions, who have not lived in those cities before, and now they pretend to serve there. So again, reaching out to these elected mayors who are out of office now is also, I think, an important sign of solidarity, and also would be very welcome at the local level, because as you know very well, when it's the municipal elections, when it's the local elections, actually national politics is a bit sidelined. Voters care a lot about municipal services. They care a lot about, the local human touch and relations. So when Erdogan removes locally elected mayors, especially in Kurdish majority provinces, and then appoints people from the outside, that's really, disastrous, not only from a political perspective, but also from this, human connection and service provision part. So if we have European and American delegations reach out to these mayors, elected mayors who have been forcefully removed from office, it would also be a very welcome development on the part of the residents of those cities, because they would see this as a solidarity directly with them, because they want mayors who speak their language, who know their customs, who know their needs, and who are basically in their service and not in Erdogan's service.
That's actually a really great initiative. I'm happy again to facilitate in any way that I can. I mean, of course, there are language limitations and things like that, but I think it's not a major obstacle. I'm hoping to kind of start looking more into these people, but at the same time, the natural question arises: how to not cause greater harm and put these and other people in whether the current or the former mayors in danger through this activity, because as you know, regimes such as Erdogan's accuse any such outreach efforts of being CIA spies and things of that nature. So the last thing anyone wants is to create more problems for people, not to mention get arrested or isolated or be turned into a boogeyman online and kind of be discredited. So what in your opinion is the best way to do these things and to avoid these people being seen as foreign agents or whatever?
Now, I'm an anthropologist. I often work through cases, so the empirical evidence matters a lot for me. And we have one good case, for example, with Pastor Brunson. When Pastor Brunson was arrested, there were two alternative policy suggestions in Washington, D.C. Some argued that Washington should look the other way, just hold back channel talks, and don't do anything publicly, and that Erdogan would ultimately release Pastor Brunson. And this was also suggested for the three employees of the U.S. consulates in Turkey who were also jailed for being terrorists by the Erdogan regime. Now, when it comes to, this is an interesting test case. When it comes to the 3 foreign service nationals working for the US consular services, US had a basically radio silence policy. And all 3 were convicted, remained in jail, and were not released. When it comes to Pastor Brunson, after 2 years of imprisonment, when the Trump administration imposed global Magnitsky sanctions against Turkey's interior minister and justice minister, and also raised aluminum and steel tariffs, so basically economic punitive measures, within a month or 2, Pastor Brunson was first released to the house arrest and then allowed to leave the country. Now, the reason I'm giving these 2 different cases is this. On the one hand, there was a very careful kind of silent treatment not to put Erdogan in a difficult position with the consular workers. And those individuals, their lives were ruined. When it comes to Pastor Andrew Brunson, there was international shaming and pressure, as well as sanctions and punitive economic measures, which delivered immediate results. We have seen the same case with the German correspondent of the site daily, Deniz Yücel, who, after spending time in Turkish prison, again on terrorism charges, on spurious terrorism charges, was finally released when Germany started playing hardball, when Germany threatened cutting Turkey's various kind of export guarantees and loans, and Erdogan immediately released them overnight. So I think ultimately we need a good mix of carrots and sticks, meaning if there is no deterrence, if there is no real threat of sanctions or punitive action, Erdogan will not move. But at the same time, we also need a good blend of carrots, meaning the Turkish government should also see that they would also benefit by doing the right thing, by ending the persecution of innocent individuals. And they should also see the credible threat of sanctions and punitive actions. And I would argue the more this is transatlantic in nature, the more effective it is. Meaning if the European Union and the United States can coordinate their action, it is always more effective. Both carrots and sticks tend to be more effective when it's coordinated transatlantic action.
It's funny because what you're telling me is so common sense, but at the same time, we have seen quite a mishandling of all of this over the past several years, for actually a very, very long time, which brought us to the place where we are seeing today. Turkey is essentially has become a very isolated member of NATO, self-isolated, one might argue. At the same time, right now we are seeing all these investments by Arab states and talk of normalization and integration without anything profoundly being changed on the ground, whether in the treatment of these minorities or improvement in economic policies. We are seeing money that is being poured in cash into Turkey with no real demands of anything concrete in return other than business policies towards those countries. So the question is, are these current overtures to Erdogan merely propping up and prolonging his continuation of these disastrous foreign and domestic policies? Do you think that more harm than good is being done by this particular form of outreach?
Now, I would present 2 different sets of policies. On the part of the European Union and the United States, often we see appeasement policy in place toward Erdogan. For the European Union, this often stems from Erdogan's weaponization of Syrian refugees, Turkey hosts over 3.6 million Syrian refugees, and Erdogan has repeatedly threatened to push them into the European Union. So basically, the European Union has been paying the Erdogan government and looking the other way about human rights transgressions, hoping that Erdogan will not weaponize these refugees. When it comes to the United States, there has been several different pragmatic reasons. Turkey has been an important NATO member in the alliance's southeast flank. Turkey has a major US base in Incirlik. Turkey now plays some mediating role in Afghanistan. So, again, Washington has been quite appeasing toward Turkey. When it comes to the Middle East, we now see a different set of normalization attempts, mainly driven by Ankara. Erdogan has realized, especially over the last 12 months, that Turkey's growing isolation in the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as in the Middle East, have had important costs diplomatically, from a military perspective, as well as from a trade perspective. So we have seen him reach out to Egypt, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, trying to kind of normalize relations, because Turkey did not even have ambassadors with some of these countries. So at this point, one could argue that relations are on the improvement path, but they still haven't reached the level of a trust-based cordial relations. Meaning, I think all these countries are watching Erdogan cautiously. They, of course, would like to normalize relations with Turkey, which is a major diplomatic, military, as well as soft power in the region. But understandably, they see Erdogan as not a dependable partner. So I think when it comes to the EU and the US, as well as when it comes to the Middle Eastern neighbors, everyone is waiting for the 2023 presidential and parliamentary elections. When the opposition bloc, which brings together center-right, center-left, and pro-Kurdish parties, could ultimately defeat Erdogan and bring Turkey back to some normalcy. Now, if that happens, over the summer of 2023, I think we will see a sudden boost in all these rapprochement processes, as well as I think we will see a much stronger engagement, both by the European Union and the United States, which hopefully will put Turkey back on the democracy track, back on the rule of law track, back on the transatlantic alliance track.
So in light of what you just said, I wanted to ask you kind of a last question. I don't want to keep you too long. I know it's getting late. About the Summit for Democracies that the US recently organized, and which has widely been criticized by many observers as not having a real agenda and not being, really focused on anything concrete. Do you think it was a missed opportunity to engage with Turkey on some of these issues, or Turkish civil society representatives, or do you think the administration basically figured, well, until 2023 nothing much is really going to change, so let's just not even bother?
Now, the Summit for Democracy was mostly a symbolic affair. Maybe it was important for signaling Washington's interest in democracy and human rights, but at the same time, not much came out of it. In fact, there was more debate on who were not invited than on who were invited. And of course, within the Western Bloc, Hungary and Turkey were two countries not invited. Now, Brookings Institute, an analyst, Kemal Kirişçi, wrote a piece for Just Security, arguing that the Biden administration did not invite Erdogan. So this was not a move against Turkey, but this was basically a message to Erdogan. And he said that this was the right move, because had they invited Erdogan, it would have helped burnish his tarnished image at home while he's under fire by Turkey's pro-democracy activists. But just as you hinted, what could have been done was to engage Turkey's leading pro-democracy voices and include Turkey in other ways, include Turkey's pro-Western, pro-democracy, pro-human rights constituents in other ways. So I understand under COVID conditions, this was a challenging event. But ultimately, I think if there is going to be a second one, definitely there should be a game plan to engage democracy activists from these countries sliding deeper and deeper into authoritarianism.
It's funny because during the Cold War, the U.S. had the entire bureaus dedicated to kind of communication with such states, with soft power, with countering propaganda on the one hand, and on providing really kind of enhanced messaging on the other. But since then, even Voice of America and all these institutions have been co-opted, mismanaged, or simply not very active in providing this sort of a very vigorous kind of U.S. focused U.S. policy alternative to local media propaganda in various states. And I'm wondering whether the reason for why this has fallen into such a state of disrepair is because U.S. itself has kind of lost track of its own goals, of its own agendas, what it stands for, how to engage with the rest of the world, whether to be isolationist, interventionist, pro-democracy, pro-realpolitik, or whatever else. It seems to me that until U.S. can sort of figure out its own direction, these sorts of efforts are not going to be very effective because there's not going to be a vision, a leadership, or strategy.
Now, I do agree that I think during the Cold War, there was a stronger consensus on common values, on common goals, and on what needs to be done. And right now, I think there is some complacency. People take our rights and freedoms for granted, our liberties for granted, and there is a decline in vigilance. But at the same time, we know that authoritarian countries, illiberal forces, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, they are using all means possible, from political to economic to disinformation to cyber, to undermine Western freedoms, rights and freedoms regime, because ultimately, the more prosperous, the freer the Western world is, the more delegitimized these regimes are, because their citizens see, the quality of life and the state of freedoms in the West, and they also demand it. Because today, in today's world, people see what others have. So I think it is really important, as you said, to have a more robust attempt to disseminate, Western values. For example, the rule of law and due process, the First Amendment, freedom of religion or belief, a rules-based market economy, and basically giving people the liberties, the opportunities to actualize themselves, to chart the course of their lives, as opposed to the CCP dictating it, or as opposed to Putin dictating it. So this definitely requires, I think, a newfound enthusiasm and vigilance to uphold Western values, and also to promote and disseminate a rights and freedoms agenda.
Well, personally, I think that despite the current period of chaos, I think there's still great room for private initiatives in this regard, in private outreach efforts and media efforts and things like that. And I think that is something that can be explored. I think this conversation is a great start to kind of formulating visions, figuring out an engagement plan, and certainly starting by providing platforms and opportunities for people seeking to have to get their voices heard and to let people know that it's not all hopeless and we should not be just giving up and going with the flow of whatever it is towards a disastrous continuity. And I'm very happy to hear about these positive efforts going on because it caught my attention. There's a lot of negativity out there, and when you hear a lot of negativity, all you hear, well, everything is terrible. What can I do about it? Just you know. But when you hear people actually leading by example, then it inspires engagement. So I'm very grateful for you for contributing to that space in that regard and for providing very very both informed and solution oriented approach to these issues. And I appreciate your time here. Thank you very much for joining.
No. Thank you, Irina, for having me and also for allowing me to, raise these important issues. Thanks again.
Thanks to everyone listening. This was the Washington Outsider Report. Merry Christmas to everyone who'll be celebrating it, and hope to see you next week, same time, 9 p.m. On the Coalition Radio. With us today was Dr. Aykan Erdemir from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we were discussing the issue of minorities in Turkey and the economic context for the ongoing issues today.